The tribunal recorder was already blinking when Dr. Marin Calloway sat down. 3 Vorti magistrates occupied the raised bench across the chamber, tall, angular beings with skin like polished obsidian and bioluminescent veins that pulsed amber when they were agitated. All 3 were agitated now. Marin could see it in the way their throat crests flared with each breath, in the way their clawed hands gripped the edges of the bench like they expected the floor to move. Behind her, through the sealed doors, she could hear Sable breathing. The sound carried through 6 inches of reinforced composite, through 2 pressure seals, through the corridor where 8 armed Accord sentries stood with their weapons drawn. A slow, massive exhalation that made the wall panels vibrate. The kind of breathing that belonged to something the Galactic Accord had classified as an extinction-level organism. "State your name, species, and professional designation for the record," the center magistrate said. His name was Adjudicator Vren, and his voice carried the precise cadence of someone who had read every regulation ever written and expected the universe to obey them. Marin Calloway, human, licensed xeno-veterinary surgeon, Frontier Medical Corps, 18 years active service. And you are the individual who made unauthorized physical contact with the organism designated VK9, a Class 7 apex war beast, in violation of Galactic Accord Containment Directive 1140. Marin looked at him. 53 years old, gray threading through dark hair pulled back from a weathered face, hands scarred from 2 decades of fieldwork on worlds that would kill most species before breakfast. She had set bones in creatures that could swallow shuttlecraft. She had sutured wounds on predators whose venom dissolved surgical steel. She had walked into dens and nests and burrows on 11 different worlds, alone, carrying nothing but a medical kit and the particular kind of calm that came from understanding. At a cellular level, that fear was the one thing that would get her killed. "I treated a wounded animal," she said. "That's my job." Vren's throat crest flared. "The organism is not an animal, Dr. Calloway. It is a Class 7 apex war beast. The Valkyran species engineered them over 400 generations as siege weapons. A single adult Valkyran has the documented capacity to destroy armored fortifications, disable military vehicles, and kill, the record shows, up to 300 armed combatants in a single engagement. VK9 is the last known surviving specimen. It was placed in permanent containment 17 years ago after it killed 41 Accord peacekeepers during a pacification operation on Valkyran Prime. 41 peacekeepers who were trying to kill its cubs," Marin said. The chamber went very quiet. Behind the magistrates, the gallery was packed Accord officials, military officers, xenobiologists, journalists from 4 different press services. The silence rippled through them like something physical. "That detail is not in the formal record," Vren said. "It's in the field reports. I read them before I went in." "You read classified containment documentation before making unauthorized contact with the most dangerous living organism in Accord custody." "I read everything I could find, because when someone asks me to treat a patient, I learn what hurt them first." Behind the wall, Sable's breathing changed, deeper, slower. The rhythm Marin had learned to recognize over 5 weeks as the sound the war beast made when it knew she was nearby. The sentries in the corridor shifted their weight, checking their weapons. Sable had been doing this since they brought Marin to the tribunal chamber 3 hours ago, tracking her through the walls, matching her location by sound, and sent through 6 layers of composite and steel. The containment team had reported it with visible discomfort. The beast knew exactly where she was. It always knew. Magistrate Salvan, the one on the left, leaned forward. She was smaller than Vren, with a sharper face and eyes that missed nothing. "Walk us through the sequence of events, Dr. Calloway, from the point of your arrival at Garrison Outpost Karath." Marin shifted in her chair. She could still feel the grit of Karath's soil under her boots, the dry heat that cracked lips in an hour, the way the twin suns painted everything in shades of copper and rust. I received a priority dispatch from the Frontier Medical Corps 5 weeks ago. Garrison Outpost Karath, a containment facility on the edge of Accord space, built into the cliffs above the Athrek Basin. Single purpose, housing VK-9. The garrison commander, Captain Drayle, had filed a medical request through civilian channels because the military veterinary division refused to send anyone. Why did they refuse? Because the last military vet who entered VK-9's containment zone was thrown 40 meters into a wall. Broken spine, punctured lung, 9 months in recovery. The one before that lost an arm. The Accord's official position was that VK-9 was untreatable. Any medical intervention would require full sedation. And the sedation protocols for a Class 7 War Beast required dosages that carried a 60% mortality risk. So they let it suffer, Salvan said, not a question. For 3 years, VK-9 had developed a wound on its left foreleg, a deep laceration from the containment barrier, self-inflicted during what Captain Drayle described as agitation episodes. The wound had become infected. The infection was spreading. Without treatment, the xenobiology team estimated VK-9 would lose the limb within 6 months and die of systemic sepsis within a year. And you agreed to attempt treatment. I didn't agree, I volunteered. Marin paused. Nobody asked me. I saw the dispatch when it came through the Corps network. Every other vet on the frontier passed on it, so I flagged myself and shipped out the next morning. Behind the wall, something shifted. A low sound, not quite a growl, not quite the deep resonance that Marin had come to think of as Sable's voice. It vibrated through the tribunal chamber floor, and a glass of water on the magistrate's bench trembled, sending concentric rings across its surface. Several people in the gallery flinched. Marin didn't flinch. She hadn't flinched in 5 weeks. That was the thing about Sable, the sounds were enormous, terrifying to anyone who didn't understand them, and absolutely precise. That particular vibration was not aggression. It was inquiry. Sable was asking, in the only language it had, whether she was safe. Continue, Vren said, his voice carefully level. I arrived at Karath on day 1. Captain Drayle met me at the shuttle pad, a Vortai officer, career military, 26 years in containment services. He gave me the brief in the transit corridor. VK-9 had been housed in a reinforced natural cave system beneath the garrison, modified with containment barriers, monitoring arrays, and a feeding system that delivered nutrient blocks through an automated chute so that no living being had to enter the zone. No one had entered the containment zone in how long? 3 years, 4 months, not since the last military vet was injured. Salvan's bioluminescent veins pulsed brighter. 3 years without direct contact. 3 years without anyone standing in the same space as VK-9, looking at it, speaking to it. 3 years of automated feeding, remote monitoring, and a wound that was slowly killing it while a garrison of 60 personnel watched on cameras and did nothing. Marin's voice stayed level, but something in it made the nearest gallery observers lean back. Captain Drayle showed me the feed. VK-9 was lying on its side in the center of the cave, favoring the left foreleg, the wound visible even on low-resolution video. It had stopped eating 3 days before I arrived. Drayle told me it did that periodically, stopped eating, stopped moving, went still for days at a time. The xenobiologists called them withdrawal episodes. I called them something else. What did you call them? Grief. The word settled into the chamber like a stone into water. In the gallery, a xenobiologist from the Accord Species Management Division opened his mouth, then closed it. Dr. Calloway, Vren said, you are not a behavioral specialist. On what basis do you make that assessment? On the basis of 18 years spent treating animals that other people gave up on. I've seen grief in 17 species across 9 worlds. I know what it looks like. VK9 lost its pack, its cubs, and its world. It's been alone in a hole in the ground for 17 years. The withdrawal episodes aren't a behavioral anomaly. They're the animal trying to die. Behind the wall, Sable went quiet. Not the quiet of rest, the quiet of listening. "Tell us about the first entry," Solvan said. Marin let out a breath. She could feel the memory in her hands, in the way her palms had been dry when she'd walked through the containment barrier, even though every cell in her body was screaming at her to turn around. Day 2. I requested access to the containment zone. Captain Drayle denied it. I submitted a formal medical override through the Frontier Medical Corps. My authority as a licensed Xenovit supersedes local command in cases of untreated animal suffering. Drayle wasn't happy about it, but he opened the barrier. "What did you bring with you?" "Medical kit, wound irrigation supplies. Topical antiseptic rated for keratinous tissue, nutrient gel packets, and a blanket." Vren's throat crest folded flat. A blanket. VK9's cave temperature runs 12 degrees below the species' comfort range. The containment team never adjusted it because they designed the system around keeping the beast lethargic. A cold war beast is a slow war beast. It's also a sick war beast. She paused. "But yes, adjudicator, I brought a blanket." "Describe what you encountered." The cave had been enormous, carved by water millennia ago and then expanded by Accord engineers who had hollowed out the softer stone and reinforced the walls with containment-grade composite. The floor was smooth basalt, cold even through her boot soles. Emergency lighting cast everything in a flat gray wash that made the shadows deep and featureless. The air smelled of mineral dust and something else, something heavy and animal. The musk of a creature that had lived in the same space for 17 years without seeing sunlight. And in the center of that cave, VK9. Marin had studied the files. She knew the measurements, but the files hadn't prepared her for the physical reality of a Valkyran war beast. Sable, she'd named it Sable before she ever saw it, because the mission brief noted its coloring as uniform dark pigmentation across all integumentary surfaces, which was a clinical way of saying it was black as deep space was lying on its right side, massive chest rising and falling with each breath. The Valkyran body plan was quadrupedal, built low and heavy like a creature designed to absorb artillery fire and keep moving. Broad skull, armored with interlocking plates of bone and keratin that covered the head, neck, and spine. 4 legs, each one thicker than Marin's torso, ending in clawed feet that had gouged channels into the basalt floor over 17 years of pacing. The shoulder height of an adult Valkyran standing was documented at 3 meters. Sable was closer to 3.5. 8,000 kilograms of war-bred apex predator, engineered to be the last thing an enemy saw before the fortification came down. The wound was worse than the video had shown. A deep gash running from the shoulder joint to mid-foreleg, the edges swollen and weeping fluid that had crusted into a dark, foul-smelling mass. The tissue around the wound was hot to the touch. She would learn this later, and the infection had spread into the deeper muscle layers. Left untreated, it would kill Sable in months, not years. The xenobiology team's estimate had been optimistic. Sable's eyes opened when Marin entered the cave. They were enormous, the size of dinner plates, set deep in the armored skull, with irises that burned a dark gold, like embers buried in ash. The pupils were vertical slits that contracted when the emergency lighting hit them, and behind them was something that made Marin's breath catch: intelligence. Not the reactive, calculating intelligence of a predator sizing up prey. Deeper than that. Slower. The intelligence of something that had spent 17 years with nothing to do but think. Those eyes tracked her across the cave floor. The war beast didn't move, didn't growl, didn't shift its massive body or raise its armored head. It watched her the way a tired old dog watches someone walk into a room, with the distant, habitual awareness of a creature that has stopped expecting anything good. Marin set her medical kit on the cave floor, 8 meters from Sable's head. She folded the blanket and set it beside the kit. Then she sat down on the cold basalt, cross-legged, and put her hands on her knees. "Hey," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm Marin, I'm a vet. I'm here about your leg." Nothing moved. The golden eyes watched. The breathing continued, slow and massive. She sat there for 4 hours. Not doing anything. Not approaching. Not reaching for instruments or making notes or calling back through the barrier for updates. She sat on the floor of a cave with the most dangerous organism in Accord custody, and she waited, because 18 years of fieldwork had taught her the only truth that mattered. Trust isn't given. It isn't demanded. It isn't administered with a sedation dart or enforced with a containment barrier. It's earned by being present, being still, and being patient enough to let the animal decide. In the monitoring room, Drayle watched with his arms crossed. Beside him, Dr. Thrawn was cycling through biometric overlays: cortisol, adrenaline, neural activity, respiratory patterns. The war beast's readings hadn't changed in 3 hours. Flat. Baseline. As if the presence of a human sitting on its floor was so unremarkable that its body had decided not to register it. "She hasn't moved," Thrawn said. "Neither has it. That's the part that concerns me. VK9's threat response latency is documented at 0.3 seconds. It should have reacted to her presence within the first minute. Aggression, territorial display, displacement behavior, something. Instead, it's lying there like she's furniture. Maybe it doesn't see her as a threat." Thrawn's mandibles clicked. Everything is a threat to a Valkyrin. That's the entire point of the species. "Everything it's encountered so far has been a threat to it," Drayle said. "Handlers with shock prods, sedation teams, armed peacekeepers. Maybe it's not that she isn't a threat. Maybe it's that she's the first thing that's walked in here and not acted like one." At the end of the 4th hour, Sable blinked. Slowly. One enormous eye closing and opening again, the gold iris catching the flat light. Then the war beast lifted its head, the movement casual, unhurried, the armored plates along its skull shifting with a sound like stones grinding, and inhaled. A deep breath. The kind that pulled air across the scent receptors in its palate, reading the chemical signature of the creature sitting on its floor. Marin felt the pull of it in her hair, in the fabric of her field jacket. Sable was smelling her, every molecule of sweat and soap and medical antiseptic, and the particular biochemistry of a human who was not, at this moment, afraid. The war beast set its head back down. Its eyes stayed open, watching her, and something in the quality of its gaze changed. Not softer exactly, more present, as if it had recategorized her from environment to entity worth watching. It was enough for day 1. She came back on day 2. Same routine, kit and blanket on the floor, cross-legged, 8 meters away. This time she talked, not about the wound, about nothing. About the color of the sky above the Athrek basin at sunset, which she'd seen from the garrison's observation deck the evening before, and which turned the cliffs the color of old bronze. About the taste of the water on Karath, which had a mineral sharpness that reminded her of a spring on Earth she'd visited as a child. About the particular quality of silence in a place where the wind couldn't reach. Sable listened. She was certain of this, even though no one on the garrison staff would have believed it. The war beast's breathing changed when she spoke, slowed, deepened, synchronized with the cadence of her voice in a way that was too consistent to be coincidence. When she paused between sentences, the breathing held. When she resumed, it eased, like a metronome finding its partner. The behavioral literature on Valkyrin was almost non-existent. The species had been weaponized, deployed, and then exterminated. Nobody had studied them as animals, but Marin had spent her career learning the languages of creatures who couldn't speak, and this one was telling her, in every way it could, "I hear you. I'm listening. Don't stop." On day 3, she moved the blanket 2 meters closer. Sable tracked the movement with its eyes but didn't react. Marin sat on the blanket this time, because the cave floor was brutal on her joints and 53 was too old to pretend otherwise. She talked about the draft horses on the farm in Alberta where she'd grown up, how they would press their enormous heads against her chest when she was small, and she'd feel their breathing through her whole body. Halfway through the third hour, she noticed something. Sable's left ear, a thick, armored crescent set deep into the side of its skull, had rotated toward her. The right ear was still tracking the cave entrance, monitoring for threats, but the left ear was pointed at her, cupped forward, catching every syllable. It was a small thing. Nobody watching the feed would have noticed, but Marin had spent 30 years reading animal bodies, and she knew what a turned ear meant. Attention. Voluntary, deliberate attention. The war beast wasn't just tolerating her voice. It wanted to hear it better. She kept talking. She told Sable about the Clydesdale mare named Duchess who had been terrified of thunderstorms, and how the only thing that calmed her was Marin sitting in the stall and talking about nothing until the storm passed. I was 9 years old, she said, and I weighed about a tenth of what Duchess weighed, and she would lean against me until I could barely breathe. But she stopped shaking. Every time. She stopped shaking because she wasn't alone. Sable's left ear stayed turned toward her for the rest of the visit. On day 4, Sable stood up. The sound alone was seismic. 8,000 kilograms of war beast rising from the cave floor, the armored plates shifting and settling, the clawed feet finding purchase on basalt that cracked under the pressure. Standing, Sable filled the cave. The armored head nearly brushed the ceiling. The shoulder height was 3.5 meters exactly. Marin had been sitting 6 meters from something the size of a building, and now that building was standing. Behind the containment barrier, alarms went off. She could hear the garrison scrambling, boots on metal, weapons charging, Drail's voice on comms ordering the response team to the barrier. They had been watching on cameras, and what they had seen was the most dangerous organism in Accord custody rising to its feet in the presence of an unarmed human. Marin didn't move. Her heart rate spiked. She was human, not a machine, but her hands stayed on her knees, and her breathing stayed even, and she looked up at the war beast standing over her with an expression that she hoped communicated what she was thinking, which was, "I'm not leaving." Sable looked down at her. The golden eyes were enormous from this angle, each one the size of a serving platter, the vertical pupils dilated wide in the low light. The war beast's breath was warm and smelled of stone and iron, and something musky that was unique to the species. Then Sable took a step forward, and another. The cave floor trembled with each one. The war beast stopped 2 meters from where Marin sat. It lowered its head slowly, the armored plates grinding, the movement deliberate and controlled in a way that spoke of enormous restraint in a creature built for enormous violence. It lowered its head until its snout was level with Marin's chest, close enough that she could see the individual scales of keratin that formed the facial armor, the old scars that crisscrossed the muzzle, the places where the bone plating had healed crooked from ancient impacts. It exhaled, a warm, slow breath that moved her hair and fogged in the cool air. Then it closed its eyes. Marin lifted her hand. She placed it flat against the armored plate above Sable's left eye, where the keratin was thickest, and the bone underneath was warm with circulating blood. The plate was rough under her palm, textured like old leather, and she could feel the pulse beneath it, slow, heavy, deep. "There you are," she said. "I've been waiting for you." Behind the containment barrier, Captain Drail watched on the security feed. His throat crest was flat. His hands were shaking. Beside him, Dr. Thrawn was staring at the monitor with an expression that suggested his entire understanding of the organism had just collapsed. "That's not possible," Thrawn said. "VK-9 has never permitted direct contact. It killed 2 handlers and critically injured 3 others. Its behavioral profile is..." "Wrong," Drail said. "Its behavioral profile is wrong." "Behavioral profiles don't just become wrong overnight, Captain. This one was wrong from the start. We profiled it under duress, armed handlers, restraints, sedation attempts, containment shock. Everything we did taught it that contact means pain. She's the first person who walked in and did nothing. Thrawn pulled up a secondary display. The cortisol readout was dropping not gradually, but in a steep, clean curve, the kind of precipitous fall that in most species indicated the transition from acute threat awareness to active safety recognition. In 17 years of monitoring, VK9's cortisol baseline had never dropped below the chronic stress threshold. It was below it now, dropping further. "Look at this," Thrawn said, his voice quieter than before. "It thinks it's safe. For the first time since we brought it here, the organism's own biochemistry is telling it that it's safe." Drayle looked at the feed. Marin was sitting on the cave floor with her hand on the armored skull of a war beast, talking about weather. She looked like she did this every day. She looked like this was normal. "We need to record everything," he said. "Everything she does, everything the organism does. I want full-spectrum monitoring on continuous archive. Whatever is happening in that cave, it has never happened before." Marin treated the wound the next morning, day 5. She'd spent the previous evening in the garrison's medical bay, which was built for vorti physiology and contained nothing useful for treating a keratinous megapredator with an infected limb. She improvised. Antiseptic irrigation rated for keratinous tissue. She mixed it herself from base compounds in the garrison's chemical stores, adjusting the concentration based on the keratin density analysis Thrawn had grudgingly provided. Debridement tools, the standard surgical set, was too small, so she modified a set of geological coring implements from the garrison's survey equipment. Topical antimicrobial compound formulated for large predator application. This she had brought with her from the core supply depot, because she had treated enough oversized predators to know that standard pharmaceutical channels never stocked what she needed. Dressing material, analgesic paste, and the blanket, which had become as much a part of the treatment protocol as any instrument in her kit. She carried everything into the cave in a field pack that weighed 12 kilograms and set up a treatment area on the blanket, 3 meters from where Sable was lying. The war beast watched every movement. When Marin knelt beside its foreleg, it shifted its weight to expose the wound, a deliberate movement, the kind of repositioning that an animal does when it understands what's about to happen and has decided to allow it. The armored plates along the foreleg separated slightly, opening gaps in the protective coverage to give her better access to the soft tissue beneath. The wound was ugly. Marin had seen worse, but not by much. The gash was 30 centimeters long, deep enough to show the dark red of exposed muscle beneath the keratinous hide. The infection had turned the edges of the wound a greenish-black, and the smell was bad, the sweet, cloying rot of dying tissue. She irrigated it first, flushing the cavity with antiseptic while Sable held perfectly still, its breathing steady, its eyes half closed. The analgesic paste went on next, numbing the area so she could debride without causing pain. Then the careful, slow work of removing dead tissue with a scalpel while 8,000 kilograms of war beast watched her hands and didn't flinch. It took 3 hours. When she finished, the wound was clean, dressed, and already showing the faint pink of healthy tissue at the margins. She sat back on her heels and looked at Sable. The war beast's eyes were fully open, watching her. "Good patient," she said. Sable exhaled. That deep, warm breath. Then it lifted its foreleg, the one she'd just treated, gently, carefully, and set its massive paw beside her knee. Not on her, beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from the keratinous claws. Marin put her hand on the paw. The scales were warm and rough, and each claw was the length of her forearm. She sat there for a while, her hand on the paw of a creature that had killed 41 armed soldiers, and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She came back on day 6 for the dressing change. Sable was already positioned when she arrived, lying on its right side, left foreleg extended, the wound exposed and waiting. It had heard her coming through the corridor and arranged itself for treatment before she walked through the barrier. "You're making me look good," she told it. Sable's ear rotated toward her, and the purring started before she touched the dressing. On day 7, she discovered the second wound. Hidden under the armored plating along Sable's right hip, where the keratin overlapped in a dense shingle pattern that made visual inspection impossible, a deep abscess. Old, calcified at the margins. The kind of chronic infection that builds over years when there is no one to notice and no one to treat. She found it because Sable shifted during the dressing change, exposing the hip, and she saw the faint discoloration in the gaps between the plates. She probed it gently with a gloved finger. Sable flinched, a massive, full-body contraction that shook the cave floor, and its jaw tightened. But it didn't snap. It didn't pull away. It held still, trembling, and made a sound that Marin recognized because she'd heard it in every animal she'd ever treated. A low, strained vocalization that meant, "This hurts, but I trust you, so I will hold still and let you help." She treated the abscess over the next 3 days, draining it, irrigating, packing it with antimicrobial compound. It was ugly work, painful work, and Sable bore it with a stoicism that made the garrison staff who watched on the feeds go quiet. The war beast would tense when the pain peaked, its claws gouging the basalt, its breathing hard and fast. And then it would look at Marin, and something in its eyes would settle, and the tension would ease, and it would hold still again. The garrison staff started coming to watch, not to the cave, to the monitoring room, where the security feeds showed what was happening in real time. Captain Drayle noticed it on day 7. Handlers, technicians, cooks, logistics staff, people who had served at Karath for years without ever looking at the containment feeds for more than the required daily check. Now they were pulling up chairs, watching the veterinarian sit with the war beast, watching Sable rest its head on its paws while Marin changed the wound dressing and talked about rainfall. On day 8, an incident that nobody reported through official channels because nobody could agree on what it meant. Marin was sitting with her back against the cave wall, eating a ration bar during a break in the treatment session. Sable, lying 4 meters away, had turned its head to watch her chew. The golden eyes tracked the movement of her jaw with a focus that would have been unsettling in any other context. Then the war beast opened its own mouth. Not a threat display, no bared teeth, no tension in the jaw musculature. It simply opened its mouth, held it for a moment, and closed it again, then opened it, then closed it. It was mimicking her chewing. Marin stopped eating. She watched. Sable did it again, the deliberate, exaggerated jaw movement of an animal that had no food in its mouth, opening and closing in approximate rhythm with hers. When she didn't resume eating, it stopped. When she took another bite, it started again. She finished the ration bar. She didn't tell anyone about it for 3 days because she was still processing what it implied. An animal that had been kept in total isolation for 17 years had just engaged in social mimicry. Not because it was hungry, not because it wanted food, because it was watching her do something and it wanted to participate. On day 9, Sable purred. That was what Marin called it. The xenobiologists would later describe it as a sustained low-frequency thoracic vibration consistent with contentment state vocalizations observed in other large predator species. But it was purring. A deep, subsonic rumble that she felt in her chest before she heard it, that vibrated through the cave floor and up through her legs and settled into her bones like warmth. Sable was lying on its side while she applied fresh dressing to the foreleg wound, and the purring started when she ran her hand along the ridge of armor above its eye, the same place she'd first touched it. Behind the barrier, Dr. Thrawn checked his instruments 3 times. That frequency has never been recorded in a Valkyrin. We don't have a behavioral category for it. Make one, Drayle said. On day 11, Sable followed her to the barrier. When Marin finished her treatment session and stood up to leave, the war beast rose and walked beside her, not in front, not behind, but beside, matching her pace, its massive stride shortened to accommodate her smaller one. They crossed the 60 meters from the cave center to the containment barrier side by side, the 8,000-kilogram predator and the human with the scarred hands. And when Marin stepped through the barrier, Sable stopped at the line and lowered its head until its snout was pressed against the barrier's surface. It stayed there, golden eyes on the corridor, until Marin was out of sight. Then it walked back to its place and lay down. "Escort behavior," Thrawn said, his voice strained with something that might have been wonder. It walked her to the door. By the second week, the wound was healing. Clean margins, healthy tissue, no sign of systemic infection. Marin adjusted the treatment regimen and expanded her visits to include general health assessment, checking Sable's teeth, its eyes, its foot pads, the places where 17 years of confinement had taken their toll in calluses and pressure sores, and the slow degradation of muscle mass in an animal built to run. Sable permitted all of it. More than permitted, participated. It would shift its position when she needed to examine a different area, lift a paw when she needed to check the underside, open its mouth when she approached with a dental scope. The coordination was uncanny, the understanding of her intent immediate and accurate, and Marin began to suspect what the behavioral literature on Valkyrin had never considered, that the species wasn't just intelligent. It was cognitively sophisticated in ways that the Accord had never bothered to test, because they had classified it as a weapon first and an organism second. "It anticipates your movements," Thrawn said, watching on the feed. "Before you reach for a tool, it adjusts. Before you shift position, it accommodates. The response lag is less than half a second." "It's not anticipating," Marin said, when Drail relayed Thrawn's observation. "It's cooperating. There's a difference. One is a calculation. The other is a choice." On day 13, the garrison cook, a broad-shouldered Vortai named Pellin, who had never shown any interest in the containment feeds, asked Drail if he could watch the morning session from the monitoring room. "Why?" Drail asked. "Because I've worked at this post for 6 years and I've never heard it make that sound." Pellin meant the purring. The low vibration had become audible through the corridor walls near the cave access, a constant, rhythmic pulse that the garrison staff had started using as background reassurance. If the purring was there, Marin was in the cave, and the war beast was calm. If it stopped, people paused what they were doing and waited for it to resume. It always resumed. On day 14, the trouble started. A priority transmission arrived from Accord Central Command. The Predator Oversight Bureau, the body responsible for all Class 7 organisms in Accord custody, had learned about Marin's presence in the containment zone. The transmission was addressed to Captain Drail, and it said, in the precise bureaucratic language that the Accord used when it wanted to sound reasonable while being monstrous, "Unauthorized civilian contact with VK-9 must cease immediately. The organism is scheduled for behavioral review. If the review determines that unsanctioned contact has altered VK-9's containment profile, euthanasia protocols will be initiated per Directive 2240. Marin read the transmission over Drail's shoulder. "They want to kill it because I made it better. They want to kill it because it's behaving differently, and different scares them more than dangerous does." Drail's throat crest was rigid. "The Bureau has wanted VK-9 terminated since the Valkyrin pacification. The only reason it's alive is that a containment specimen is more politically useful than a dead one. But a containment specimen that's showing behavioral change, that responds to a human, that cooperates with treatment, that purrs, that's unpredictable. And unpredictable is the one thing the Bureau can't tolerate. I'm not stopping treatment." "I know." Drail's throat crest settled. He was quiet for a moment. "My commanding officer at my first posting told me something I've never forgotten. He said the difference between a good soldier and a useless one is knowing when the regulation is there to protect people, and when it's there to protect the people who wrote it. I've served under the Accord for 26 years, and this is the first time I've seen a regulation that's purely there to protect people who have never set foot in a containment zone from having to admit that they got it wrong. So what do we do? I'm not ordering you to stop treatment. I'm also going to file a medical necessity override with the Frontier Medical Corps, which will put a procedural hold on any termination action until the override is adjudicated. That buys us time. He paused. Use it. She did. She doubled her treatment sessions. She documented everything: wound measurements, behavioral observations, cortisol readings, the escort behavior, the social mimicry, the purring frequency and duration. She compiled it into a medical case file so comprehensive that Thrawn, reviewing it, said it was the most thorough xenoveterinary report he had ever seen, and also the most inconvenient, because it made it very difficult for the Bureau to claim that VK9 was an unreachable animal. The behavioral review team arrived 4 days later. 3 Bureau officials, 2 Vortai, and a Cyrelian, all wearing the silver-trimmed uniforms of the Predator Oversight Bureau, all carrying data slates loaded with containment directives and risk assessments, and the particular vocabulary of people who managed living things without ever touching them. The lead reviewer was a Vortai named Director Korath. He stood in the monitoring room and watched the security feed showing Marin inside the cave, changing Sable's wound dressing while the war beast rested its head on its paws. Its eyes were half closed. It was purring. How long has the civilian been entering the containment zone? 18 days, Drail said. Without sedation protocols. Without sedation, without restraints, without weapons. She walks in with a medical kit and sits on the floor. Korath's expression didn't change, but his bioluminescent veins went dark, the Vortai equivalent of going pale, and the organism's aggression markers. 0. In 18 days, VK9 has shown no aggressive behavior toward Dr. Calloway. No threat displays, no territorial posturing, no contact violence. The wound is healing. The withdrawal episodes have stopped. The organism is eating on schedule for the first time in 3 years. That's precisely the problem, Captain. An organism with a documented kill count of 41 does not simply stop being dangerous because a human sat on a floor. What you're describing is a behavioral deviation that suggests either neurological compromise or an unprecedented adaptation. Either possibility makes VK9 less predictable, not more, and less predictable means higher risk. Higher risk to whom? To everyone. Marin was in the cave when she heard about the review. Drail told her through the intercom, his voice careful. She was sitting with her back against Sable's flank. The war beast had started positioning itself so she could lean against it during the rest periods after treatment, and the armored hide was surprisingly warm, heated by the massive cardiovascular system beneath. She could feel the purring through her spine. "They're here to justify termination," she said. "I think so. How long do I have?" "The review is scheduled for 3 days. They'll observe remotely, assess the behavioral data, and make a recommendation." 3 days. "Marin," Drail paused. "I've served at this garrison for 9 years. I've watched VK9 on those feeds every day. I've watched it pace the same circuit, eat the same nutrient blocks, lie in the same spot, go still for days at a time. I've watched it deteriorate. And in 18 days, you've done what 17 years of containment couldn't. You've given it a reason to be alive. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that when the review comes, I will be on your side. But I'm also telling you that the Bureau has never reversed a termination recommendation in its history." Sable shifted behind her, the purring deepened. The massive head turned, and one golden eye regarded Marin with the steady, patient attention she had come to recognize as the war beast's way of saying, "I am here." She put her hand on the armored plate above its eye. "I know you are." Director Korath entered the containment zone on day 20. He came with 2 Bureau assessors and 4 armed sentries, all in full protective gear. The sentries carried neural disruptors, weapons designed to overwhelm a target's nervous system with a focused electromagnetic pulse. They were the only weapons rated for use against Class 7 organisms, and they were set to maximum output. Marin was already in the cave. She was kneeling beside Sable's foreleg, applying a fresh antiseptic wash to the wound, which was now closed at the margins and showing healthy tissue across 80% of its surface. Sable was lying on its right side, left foreleg extended, watching the entrance. The moment Korath's team entered the cave, everything changed. Sable's eyes opened wide. The pupils contracted to thin slits. The purring stopped, cut off like a switch thrown, and was replaced by a sound that Marin had never heard from the war beast. A low, grinding resonance that she felt in her teeth, in her sinuses, in the marrow of her bones. Not a growl, deeper than a growl. The sound of a siege weapon spinning up. The armored plates along Sable's skull and spine rose. Each one was the size of a serving tray, edged with keratin that had been bred to cut through fortification walls, and they erected in sequence from the base of the skull to the root of the tail, transforming the war beast's silhouette from resting animal to something that cities were built to withstand. The sentries raised their weapons. Korath stopped walking. Behind him, the assessors took a step backward. Marin stood up. She put herself between Sable and the review team. Not dramatically, not with her arms spread or her voice raised. She simply stepped into the space between the war beast and the intruders and stood there, her medical kit in one hand, her shoulders square. "Lower the weapons," she said. "Dr. Calloway, step aside. The organism is displaying threat behavior. The organism is displaying protective behavior. There is a difference, and if you don't know it, you have no business conducting a behavioral review." Her voice was even. Behind her, Sable's grinding resonance continued, the armored plates fully raised, the golden eyes locked on Korath, and the sentries with the calculating precision of a creature that had been designed to identify threats and eliminate them. But it hadn't moved. Marin was standing in front of it, and it hadn't moved. "Lower the weapons," she said again, "slowly, and holster them." Korath looked at her. Then he looked past her, at 8,000 kilograms of raised armor and burning golden eyes. "If I do that, and the organism attacks, it won't attack because you're not a threat. You're a stranger with bad intentions, and it knows the difference. But if your sentries fire those disruptors, they will hurt it, and then it will respond. And then the 4 of you will learn something that the 41 peacekeepers on Valkyrin Prime learned too late. You cannot fight this animal. You can only be trusted by it, or you can die." The cave was silent except for Sable's resonance, and the harsh breathing of 4 sentries who had just been told, in simple terms, that their weapons were irrelevant. Korath made a decision. She could see it happen behind his eyes, the political calculation, the risk assessment, the realization that if this went wrong, his name would be on the report. He raised one hand. The sentries lowered their weapons. Sable's plates didn't lower, but the grinding resonance dropped by half a register, and the war beast's massive body shifted slightly toward Marin, not away, settling its weight around her, positioning itself so that its armored flank was between her and the armed strangers. It wasn't defending the cave, it was defending her. Korath saw it. She watched him see it, the way his throat crest went flat, the way his bioluminescent veins dimmed, the way his data slate lowered to his side as the protocol and the risk assessment, and the 17 years of classification all crumbled in the face of a war beast that had chosen to protect a 53-year-old veterinarian instead of attacking the threat. "I'll conduct the observation from the monitoring room," he said. He left, the sentries left, the assessors left, and in the cave, Sable's armored plates lowered, one by one, and the grinding resonance faded into the deep, slow purr that Marin felt in her bones. She turned and put both hands on the war beast's snout. "Good," she said. "That's my good one, you did good." Sable exhaled. The warm breath moved her hair. One golden eye closed slowly, then opened. And the massive paw, the one attached to the foreleg she'd spent 3 weeks healing, lifted from the cave floor and settled beside her feet, claws folded under, the way a dog rests its paw next to the person it belongs to. The review lasted 3 days. Korath observed from the monitoring room. He watched Marin enter the cave each morning, watched Sable's breathing change the moment it detected her scent, watched the war beast position itself to receive treatment with a cooperation that no sedation protocol had ever achieved. He watched the purring. He watched the paw placement. He watched Marin lean against Sable's armored flank during rest periods and talk about weather and horses and the smell of pine forests on Earth. On the 3rd day, he watched something that made him set his data slate on the console and sit down. Marin had tripped on a tool strap. A minor stumble, her boot caught, she went to one knee, she hissed at the impact. Half a second. A human reflex, a small sound of discomfort, nothing more. Sable was on its feet before the sound ended. The cave shook. The monitoring feeds blurred from the vibration. 8,000 kilograms of war beast, rising from rest to full stance in under a second, armored plates raised, head swiveling, golden eyes scanning the cave with the systematic precision of a weapon system acquiring targets. The grinding resonance was back, louder than before, and the war beast was between Marin and the cave entrance before she'd finished getting to her feet. It was the containment breach incident all over again, Drayle realized, watching from beside Korath. The matriarch on the station. The same response, instantaneous, collective, absolute. Except this wasn't a juvenile clutch reacting to a stumble. This was a Class 7 apex war beast, the last of its kind, an organism that had killed 41 armed soldiers, positioning itself between a middle-aged human veterinarian and a threat that didn't exist. Because the threat didn't need to exist. Sable had heard Marin in pain, and everything else had become secondary. Marin put her hand on the armored snout. "I'm fine, just tripped, I'm fine." The plates lowered. The resonance faded. Sable dropped its head and pressed its snout against her chest, the way it did when it wanted to feel her heartbeat, and the purring started again, deep, rumbling, the vibration of something that had decided it would rather die than let her be hurt. Korath left the monitoring room. He walked past the sentries in the corridor without acknowledging them. Past the mess hall where garrison staff looked up from their meals and saw the expression on his face and looked back down. Past the shuttle bay where the wind off the Athrek basin whipped through the open doors carrying dust and heat. Drayle found him 20 minutes later on the observation deck, standing at the railing with the twin suns burning copper on the cliffs below and his data slate dark at his side. The wind had flattened his throat crest. "I've been in the Bureau for 31 years, Korath said without turning. "I have overseen the containment of 68 Class 6 and Class 7 organisms. I have signed 19 termination orders. I have never once questioned a recommendation." He paused. The bioluminescent veins along his forearms were pulsing in an irregular rhythm that Drayle recognized as distress. "I came here to sign a 20th. And now I've seen a war beast put its body between a human and a doorway because she tripped on a strap." He turned. "Captain, the 41 peacekeepers that VK-9 killed on Valkyrin Prime. I've read those reports 100 times. I've used them to justify every containment decision I've ever made about this organism. But I read them again last night, and I noticed something I never noticed before." "What?" "The peacekeepers were sent to euthanize the cubs. They entered the den with lethal force authorization. VK-9 killed them in the den, within a 20-meter radius of the juvenile remains. It didn't pursue. It didn't attack the secondary team stationed outside. It killed the ones who were killing its children, and then it stopped." He paused. "That's not the behavior of a weapon, Captain. A weapon doesn't stop. A weapon doesn't discriminate. A weapon doesn't stand over the bodies of its dead offspring and wait to die." The wind moved between them. Below, the Athrek basin stretched out under copper light, empty and ancient. "If I sign the termination order," Korath said, "and the organism is euthanized, and the human is present when it happens, what do you think will happen?" "I think the organism will not fight the sedation. I think it will look at Dr. Calloway while it dies, and I think Dr. Calloway will never forgive any of us." "No," Korath said. "I think the organism will fight the sedation, not to save itself, to reach her, because the last thing it will want is to be near her when it dies." He closed his eyes. "And I think that is not the behavior of a weapon, that is the behavior of something that loves." The tribunal chamber was very quiet. Marin had been speaking for over an hour, and the gallery behind her was motionless, and the three magistrates had not interrupted for the last 20 minutes. Behind the wall, Sable's breathing was slow and steady. The purring had started again, the deep, subsonic vibration that carried through the structure of the building and settled into the bones of everyone in the room. Several people in the gallery had their hands flat on the bench in front of them, feeling it. "Dr. Calloway," Vren said. His throat crest was flat, and his voice had lost the procedural sharpness it had carried at the start. Director Korath's review recommended indefinite suspension of euthanasia protocols for VK9 and the establishment of a supervised treatment program under your direction. The Predator Oversight Bureau rejected this recommendation and filed a termination order. This tribunal was convened to adjudicate. Do you have a final statement? Marin looked at the three magistrates. She looked at the gallery, the officials, the officers, the scientists, the journalists. She looked at the wall behind her, where 6 inches of composite separated her from an animal that had been alone for 17 years, and had decided, in the way that animals decide things, that she was worth protecting. "Sable is not a weapon," she said. "I know that's what the file says. I know that's what the Accord decided when it classified the Valkyran species as military assets and spent 400 generations breeding them for war. But the Accord was wrong. Sable is an animal, an intelligent, social, loyal animal that was taken from its world, watched its cubs killed, and was put in a hole in the ground for 17 years. And when a human sat on the floor of that hole and said, 'I'm here about your leg,' it chose to trust her. Not because it was engineered to. Not because it was too sick to fight. Because it recognized something in her that it hadn't seen in 17 years, which was someone who looked at it and saw an animal instead of a weapon." She paused. Behind the wall, the purring deepened. "You can sign the termination order. You have that authority, but I want you to know what you'll be killing. You won't be killing a Class 7 Apex War beast. You'll be killing the last living Valkyran in the galaxy, an animal that survived the extinction of its species, the loss of its family, and 17 years of isolation, and still had enough left in it to lower its head and let a stranger touch the place where it was hurt." Her voice was steady. "You'll be killing my patient. And I will not leave this building until you tell me whether it lives or dies." The chamber was silent. Vren looked at Salvan. Salvan looked at the third magistrate, who had not spoken during the entire hearing, and whose bioluminescent veins were pulsing in a rapid, unsteady rhythm. Then Vren looked at the wall behind Marin, where the purring vibrated through the composite and the structural supports and the bench itself, filling the room with the steady, deep heartbeat of something enormous and gentle, and absolutely certain about one thing in a universe that had given it nothing else to be certain about. His throat crest lowered. He picked up his data slate. His hand was steady, but his veins were pulsing faster than Marin had seen on any Vortai. The third magistrate spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it in hours, which was true. "I'd like to add something to the record before the adjudicator reads his finding." Vren looked at him. "Magistrate Deln. The Valkyran species was engineered as a weapon. That fact is in every file this tribunal has reviewed. What is not in any file is the equally relevant fact that the species was engineered from a social bonding predator, a pack animal with pair bond behaviors, parental investment, and grief responses. The Valkyrian military took an animal that loved its family and turned it into a siege engine. The organism in the next room killed 41 soldiers who were killing its cubs. The organism in the next room spent 17 years in solitary confinement. The organism in the next room chose to trust the first person who sat down and treated it like what it was. He paused. Which is not a weapon. It is the last surviving member of a species we destroyed. And what Dr. Calloway has done is not unauthorized contact. It is the first humane act this organism has experienced since we took it. The chamber was completely still. Deln sat back. His veins were pulsing in a rapid, unsteady rhythm, and his throat crest was fully raised. Vren looked at the data slate. He looked at the wall behind Marin where the purring filled the room. He read, "This tribunal finds that VK9, redesignated Sable, per the treating veterinarian's field nomenclature, is to be reclassified from contained military asset to protected xenobiological individual under supervised medical care. The termination order filed by the Predator Oversight Bureau is vacated. Dr. Marin Calloway is designated as primary caregiver with full access to the containment to the care facility. Treatment will continue under her authority." He set the data slate down. "This hearing is concluded." Marin stood. Her knees ached from the hard bench and from 5 weeks of kneeling on cave floors. Her hands were steady. They had been steady when she'd irrigated an infected wound on a creature that could have bitten her in half. They had been steady when she'd stood between that creature and 4 armed sentries. They were steady now. She walked to the sealed doors at the back of the chamber, where 8 armed sentries stood with their weapons drawn, and said, "Open the doors." The sentries looked at each other. They looked at the magistrates. Vren nodded once. The doors opened. 6 inches of composite swung inward, and the corridor beyond was filled with Sable. The war beast had positioned itself directly against the doors, as close as it could get, its massive armored head pressed against the composite the way it pressed against Marin's chest when it wanted to feel her heartbeat. Its golden eyes found her the moment the doors moved, and the purring already audible through the walls became a sound that filled the corridor and the chamber and the chests of every person present. Marin stepped into the corridor. She put both hands on the armored plate above Sable's left eye. The war beast exhaled, warm and slow, and closed its eyes. "We're going home," she said. Behind her, in the tribunal chamber, the gallery sat in silence. The sentries had lowered their weapons without being told, not because they had been ordered to, because the sound coming from the corridor, the deep, rumbling purr of a creature that had found the person it had been waiting for, made the idea of pointing a weapon at it feel obscene. Director Korath was standing in the back row, his data slate dark, his throat crest flat. Drayle stood beside him. On Korath's face was an expression that Drayle would later describe as the look of a man who has spent 31 years managing weapons and has just realized he was managing people. "I'm going to submit a formal recommendation," Korath said, his voice low. "Full reclassification of the Valkyrian species. Retroactive. Every record, every file, every directive that categorizes them as military assets, all of it revised." He looked at the corridor where Marin was standing with her hands on the war beast's face. "We owe them that. What's left of them." Vren's last act before leaving the bench was to add a note to the tribunal record. It was not standard procedure. It was not required, but he wrote it, and it would remain in the file for as long as the Accord kept records. The organism is not a weapon. It never was. The error was ours. In the corridor, Marin Calloway stood with her hands on the face of the last living Valkyrian in the galaxy, and the war beast leaned into her touch with its full weight, 8,000 kilograms pressing gently against 140 pounds of human. And the sound it made was not the grinding resonance of a siege weapon or the silence of 17 years of grief, but something that needed no classification and no behavioral category and no place in any file. It was the sound of something that had been alone for a very long time and wasn't anymore. And in the tribunal record, between the formal findings and the procedural notes, there was a small annotation that Salvan had added without comment: the purring frequency that had vibrated through the chamber during the final statement, measured by the building's structural monitoring system. The frequency was 26.3 hertz, the exact resonance of a human heartbeat at rest. Sable had tuned its voice to the rhythm of the woman standing on the other side of the wall, matching her pulse without being able to hear it, because 17 years alone had taught it many things, and 5 weeks with Marin Calloway had taught it one more: how to sound like home,